My name is Serena Longo, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore and Oxfam America, I'm very pleased to welcome you to this evening's event with Peter Singer, presenting his new book, The Most Good You Can Do. Peter Singer is an acclaimed ethicist, a utilitarian philosopher, and author of more than 20 previous titles, including Animal Liberation, Practical Ethics, The Way We Eat, and The Life You Can Save.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be supporting Harvard Bookstore and talking to you about effective altruism. So I suppose if you're not already familiar with this idea, your first question will be, well, what is effective altruism? So since something doesn't exist until it has a Wikipedia page, fortunately effective altruism has one. And as the Wikipedia page suggests, I think this is one of the occasions where Wikipedia is entirely accurate. It is both a philosophy, or you could say a philosophical outlook in terms of what you ought to do with your life, and an emerging social movement. And the idea of the outlook is that you ought to spend at least a significant amount of your resources, which might be money, might be time, and your skills, in doing things to make the world a better place. And not just make the world a better place, but you ought to use those resources to do as much good as you can, to make it, to do the most good. And in doing that, it's not enough just to think this is what I most care about, I'm just following my passion, this is what I feel like doing. Rather, it's important to look at evidence about what will do the most good and to use your capacities to reason to reflect on that. So that's really what it is that we're talking about, and I'm very happy that this movement is emerging at this particular moment, because the issue itself is one that I've been interested in for a very long time. One of my first academic publications came out in 1972, was called Famine, Affluence and Morality. And as an academic article, it was highly successful. It was successful in the sense that it got reprinted in a lot of anthologies that were used for teaching. And perhaps some of you here may have taken a philosophy course in which you read that article, or some of you may be teaching philosophy in which you've used that article. But as Professor Josh Green, who introduced me last night when I was speaking to a group of organized by Harvard Effective Altruists, and Josh Green was an undergraduate studying philosophy here before he went into study of moral psychology, which is what he's doing now. He said when he was an undergraduate, although the article was very widely taught, the point of teaching it was to say, look, here's a challenge, it's a very plausible argument here, but the conclusion is obviously false, so you have to tell us why. And what Josh said to the audience yesterday is, now it seems that there are a lot of people who are saying, the conclusion is obviously correct, and we should be thinking how to live our lives in accordance with that conclusion. So if that's true, obviously, it's a very heartening switch in terms of not just putting up a good argument, but really people thinking what to do in terms of the conclusions I reached. But let me tell you a bit more about some of the values that I think effective altruists appeal to in thinking about how to live their lives. This is actually originally not mine. It's drawn from someone called Holden Karnofsky, who I'll tell you a little bit about as we go on. But I've tweaked it because I think some of the things maybe needed slightly different emphasis. So the first thing about effective altruists is, as I said, they want to make the world a better place. So they are really taking a universal perspective. They're not concerned just to make their own community a better place or to help people with whom they have some sort of personal connection. They really are interested in doing what's the best, the most good from a kind of universal perspective, a universal point of view. And in terms of what will make the world a better place, although they may have a range of different values, they have a common core as well, which are things like reducing suffering, improving well-being, and also preventing premature death, preventing people dying when they're young and wouldn't need to. And then, as it says here, they may hold other values like justice, equality, and fairness, or they may think there are certain moral rules you ought never to violate. But for many of them, the point of this will still be that a society will have less suffering, better welfare, if it follows those principles. So they don't necessarily see those principles as intrinsically important, although some of them might. I don't think it's in any sense necessary to be a pure utilitarian, for example, in order to be an effective altruist. Although if you are a pure utilitarian, then you certainly will think you ought to be an effective altruist, but the converse doesn't really hold. And as I say, they think we should seek to maximize expected value because, of course, there's always uncertainty about what will have good consequences. So it may be that you can do something which has a very high probability of having a small benefit, let's say 10 units of benefit. Let's say it's virtually certain to have 10 units of benefit. And you can have something which might have a 10% chance of 100 units of benefit. So you might regard those as equivalent, at least if you had complete certainty of getting the 10 units. Those would be equivalent because they have the same expected value. You discount the value of the outcome by the probability of achieving it. Okay, so philosophically, as I say, this idea of taking a universal perspective has certainly been defended, and one of the philosophers who's defended it is the great 19th century utilitarian Henry Sidgwick, who put it this way: from the point of view of the universe, and note the parenthetical, if I may say so, which indicates he's not really saying that the universe has a point of view, but he's rather saying we can take that point of view and then we can see that the well-being of any individual has as much significance as my own, assuming that the quantities of suffering or well-being or welfare are the same. So that's the kind of universal perspective we're talking about, recognizing that there are lots of other people out there, lots of other sentient beings out there, and their well-being matters. By the way, that reminds me, to go back here, that I skipped over one line, which was about animal suffering. So I've been concerned from about the same time that I was concerned about what we ought to do for the global poor in the 1970s, I've been concerned about the suffering of non-human animals. And to me, that's an important part of effective altruism, that if you have opportunities to reduce the suffering of animals, those are things that you ought to do. And I think that's a very widely held view in the effective altruism movement, but it's not something that everybody holds, or at least people would disagree about how much weight to put on that. So they might disagree about priorities, because some would think that reducing animal suffering, if you can do it in a very cost-effective way, might be the best thing to do. Others might think that reducing global poverty or helping the global poor is the best thing to do. And some effective altruists think that reducing small risks of the extinction of our species, even though those risks are quite small, like, for example, an asteroid colliding with our planet and wiping us out, or perhaps somewhat more speculative, what people refer to as the singularity, artificial intelligence becoming smarter than we are and taking us over and deciding that it's a nuisance having humans on Earth and getting rid of us. So some people think that reducing those possibilities, even if they are quite small risks, even further, is a very important thing to do. So there's differences about what are the goals, but I'm mostly going to be talking about global poverty, just because that's one on which there is, I think, general agreement that this is an important goal. Now let me say a little bit about the movement and how it's developed, as I say, in just really quite recent years. Sorry, I've already shown that. So here's a person who I think was very influential in the early stages, still is influential. And I'll just tell you a little bit about his thinking because I think it indicates how an effective altruist might think. Toby Ord was a graduate student at the University of Oxford studying philosophy, doing very well, highly likely to be able to have an academic career, but living at the time on a graduate studentship, which I think was paying him about £14,000 a year. But he thought, this is really adequate. This meets my needs. I'm not really wanting anything very important in my life. And I could just go on living on something like a graduate studentship, even after I get an academic job that pays me quite a bit more. And then he started wondering, so suppose he did that. Suppose that throughout his career until retirement, he lived on his studentship, or not, you know, on something like the monetary equivalent of his studentship, and gave away the rest of his income. How much would he have to give, and what would it achieve? Well, I won't go into all the calculations, but in terms of what it would achieve, he decided to look at ways of, at the cost of restoring sight in people who are blind because of cataracts. So in the United States and other affluent countries, essentially people aren't blind because of cataracts. It's quite a simple operation to remove them. Your health insurance will pay for it, or if you're over 65, you'll get it on Medicare, and if you're really poor and you're under 65, you'll get it on Medicaid. But in developing countries, there are millions of people who are blind with cataracts. And there are organizations that you can donate to which support surgery to remove it. There are reasonably good estimates of the cost of doing that. They vary a little bit, but essentially with the figure that Toby Ord came up with, which I think maybe he came up with $25, I'm not sure. And let's say, you know, you can vary the numbers if you think that that's too low. It might be $50, maybe it'll even be $100, but the marginal cost of extra operations doesn't seem to be more than that. He calculated that he could, if he lived that way, restore sight to 80,000 people. And when he came out with that outcome, he thought that was a really impressive result. It was an extraordinary thing to be able to do with your life. If you were able to restore sight to just a handful of people, you would think that was an important thing. But 80,000 is a very large number. And so Toby decided to do more or less that, to pledge to live on something like his graduate studentship, adjusted for inflation, and to donate the rest. And he also decided to set up a website which would tell people about this, because he thought if more people knew how much good you could do without any great sacrifice, then they might be inclined to do it. So he is now a research fellow, and he's doing this. As I point out, he's not a hermit living in a cave. He's a normal sort of person, married with a mortgage. But then when I put that up, somebody said, well, maybe his wife is an investment banker and hasn't taken the pledge. Actually, his wife is a doctor, but she has taken a similar kind of pledge. So they are both living on relatively limited amounts and donating the rest. Here's somebody who helped Toby to set up Giving What We Can in Oxford, but also established another website, 80,000 Hours, that I'm going to talk about in a moment. And I want to mention Will particularly, and I hope the Harvard Bookstore people are taking note, because Will is coming out with another book in this area in a few months. It's going to be called Doing Good Better. It takes a somewhat different approach to the topic, focuses on different questions from what I focus on in my book. So it's not like you need to buy one or the other. Don't save up for his. Please buy mine tonight. But But do buy his as well when it comes out. I've seen it, I've seen the proofs, and it's going to be an excellent book. Okay, so what is 80,000 hours? You can look at it online. It's 80,000 hours is not just happens coincidentally to be the same number as the number that I think Toby came up with about restoring sight. It's Will's calculation of the number of hours most people spend working in their career. And he called it that to emphasize that this is a pretty big decision that people make. They're going to spend a lot of their life thinking about this. And if you're thinking about living an ethical life, you might want to think about how you can do the most good in your career. So Will was thinking about that, and he looked at what kind of advice is around online about that. And he found that the kind of advice he got was fairly obvious and not necessarily, in his view, covering all the possibilities. So it was the things like, well, you could become an aid worker, you could work for Oxfam or one of those other organisations and do some good there. And, or you could become a doctor maybe, and then you could perform these surgeries, you could do good that way. But Will thought there were other possibilities, and at least one other interesting possibility was one that people might not think about. You might, for example, decide to become an investment banker, or go into Wall Street and be some kind of trader of some sort. Now, why do you think you would do that if you were trying to live an ethical career? Well, Will thinks about it this way: the more money you earn, the more money you can donate. And donations can do a great deal of good. How would you compare that with the good you could do if you did work for Oxfam? Let's take Oxfam, as there are some Oxfam people here, and Oxfam has its head office, Oxfam America has its head office in this city. So suppose they're advertising for a position, and you apply, and let's suppose that you get it, and you then work for Oxfam, and you do the best of your abilities, and you do various good things. But how much good has your decision to work for Oxfam actually achieved? It's not everything that you've been able to do in the job, because being a well-regarded organisation, when Oxfam advertises for a job, it gets several well-qualified applicants. So no doubt it picks the best applicant, and if you get the job, you are the one that Oxfam thinks is the best applicant. But the difference that you make by taking the job is really only the difference between what you can achieve and what the second best applicant in the field could achieve, who would have got the job if you'd not been in the field at all. So that's probably a fairly marginal kind of difference. It will depend, obviously, on how large the field is, how accurate Oxfam is in assessing who's the best and the second best applicant, but it's certainly less than the entire good of the position. Now, suppose you go into investment banking. In one sense, the same thing applies. From the point of view of the corporation, the good you do to the bank is just the difference between you and the next best applicant. But since you are planning to give a large proportion of your income to effective charities, and it's very unlikely that the next applicant is going to do the same, because most investment bankers don't do that. So the good that you do is all of the money that you donate to organisations. So let's say, as you'll see in a moment, this is a very plausible thing. Let's say you're able to give $100,000 to Oxfam a year as a result of having this high income. So then Oxfam can presumably create a completely new position, maybe even more than one completely new position, but let's just say it's one, with this income that you're now donating to it. And the good that that position does is not a marginal difference between the best applicant and the second best applicant. It's the whole good that the position does, because otherwise there wouldn't have been that sort of position at all. So that's Will's argument for saying that you're actually likely to do more good if you have the abilities and skills that will earn you a high income than if you become an aid worker. And here's somebody who actually did this, happens to be a former student of mine at Princeton, who started thinking about this after taking a course with me and also after talking to people in effective altruism groups around Princeton. It's called Matt Wager, not Matt Wage, although he happens to be giving most of his wage or half of his wage to effective organisations. But he had the ability to get one of these jobs. Perhaps his background in math as well as philosophy helped. And he's now actually about 3 years out of graduation, I think. The slide needs updating. So he has been giving six-figure sums each year to effective charities. And I had him speak to my class last year, and people asked him, perhaps a thought that you've had in your heads, well, here you are working alongside other people who are earning as much as you, but using it to be able to buy a Porsche or a Ferrari and a nice penthouse apartment in Tribeca. Aren't you going to get corrupted by working with these people? Aren't you going to want a similar lifestyle for yourself? And Matt's answer was, well, at least so far he hasn't wanted to do that. He's got a lot of satisfaction out of knowing what he's able to do with his money. And moreover, he's been quite public about what he's doing. He's told his friends about why he's gone to Wall Street and what he's doing with it. And he's, as you can see, he's allowed me to use his name, his real name, in this presentation, and he's featured in the book as well. In fact, just last Sunday, Nick Kristof wrote his New York Times, not yesterday, but the one before, his New York Times column about the book and featured Matt there. So he's been very public about what he's doing. And he therefore says he'll feel very ashamed if he actually does start spending a lot of money on himself, because he's made this public commitment. So I think for Matt, it's a good strategy. As I say, I'm not sure that everybody will have either the same abilities or the same character, but I do think that it can be a way of being an effective altruist, and Matt is not unique. There are certainly other people who are doing similar things. And here's somebody who is actually from this area, Julia Wise, and her partner Jeff Kaufman, who live in the Boston area. And they have, at least in the past, been a somewhat different example, because there was a time when they didn't have very much, when I think maybe when they were earning less than $40,000 a year and living in this area, not the least expensive part of the United States, but they still managed to give away quite a significant slice of their income. Jeff, fortunately, just a year or two ago, Jeff works with computers and got a job at Google, so their income has gone up, and they're now giving half rather than a third of their income. And Julia writes about this on her blog, see down the bottom here, givinggladly.com. If you're interested in how they do it and the way they think about the spending decisions that they make, then do read Julia's blog. I think she really writes well, and it's a very insightful way of looking at effective altruism. Okay, so those are some of the people in the movement, to give you that sort of personal flavour. Now I want to say just a little bit about choosing what cause to work with. And the point of this is really to stimulate people to think about philanthropy in general, because philanthropy, or giving to charity, is a very large segment of the United States economy, really. It's about 2% of gross domestic product is given to charity, $335 billion a year, of which about $240 billion is given by individuals, the rest by foundations and corporations. So it's quite a significant figure. I mean, it totally dwarfs US foreign aid, for example. And it's therefore important that people think about how to choose, at least how to choose the most effective use of their resources. But typically they don't, and they're not even encouraged to do so by advisors in the field. So this is really what I want to talk about. This is Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors website, so one of the biggest philanthropy advisors, the long history of advising wealthy clients what to do with their money. You can go online to the website and have a look at it. You'll find this leaflet called Finding Your Focus in Philanthropy. And although, you know, that's obviously a good thing to do, when you then look at how they suggest you do that, there are some problems. This is the way they picture the field of philanthropy. I'm not sure whether you can all see that from the back, but I have a couple of problems with this way of picturing the field. One is, as I said before, I'm interested in animal welfare issues, reducing animal suffering or animal rights issues, however you want to put it, but they don't fit anywhere in this particular set of categories. So it's nice for wealthy Manhattanites and anybody else who travels to New York and wants to listen to a concert to have a beautifully renovated concert hall. But again, how do you compare that with the amount of good that can be done in saving lives or restoring sight or a variety of other improvements in the lives of people who are in extreme poverty? I think, contrary to what Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisor says, I think it is obvious that there are objective answers to at least some choices that some people in the field of philanthropy are making, and I think some of them are making the wrong choices. Now, actually, I just did a radio interview about this recently, and the interviewer said, well, but aren't people free to make their own choices? And of course, I'm not trying to take their right to choose away from them. I'm not trying to say David Geffen's money should have been confiscated and given to a charity that would be more effective. I'm just saying, why can't we try to persuade more people to make a better set of choices where they'll do more good? And since another right, presumably, is freedom of expression, I'm simply exercising my freedom of expression in trying to present considerations that I hope would persuade people to make different choices from the choices that they're making. So here's one of the options, by the way. I've talked about cataract surgery. There's another very inexpensive way of not curing but preventing blindness. Trachoma is the largest single cause of blindness in the world. It's a microorganism that gets in the eyes of children quite young and very, very slowly, progressively blurs their vision until perhaps by the time they're about 40 or something like that, they will go blind, and then they will spend the rest of their lives blind. But it is quite cheaply and inexpensively prevented, and these children are lining up for a clinic that will prevent them getting it, again, as I say, at very low cost. So that's an alternative to some of those charities that I've mentioned. Okay, now some people say, this is again quite a recent example, comes from a comment, one of the online comments on the online version of the column by Nicholas Kristof that I just mentioned. Some people say, well, why not do both? Why am I critical of giving to the arts? Why can't we do both? They're both valuable, aren't they? Well, why not take a neutral view? Well, I think it's not a false choice at all. I think it's an unavoidable choice because everyone's resources are limited. Even Bill Gates' resources are limited, or Warren Buffett's. If they had given half of what they have given to the Gates Foundation and half of it to the arts, then there would have been fewer resources to help treat some of those diseases. The Gates Foundation, incidentally, supplemented and continued and expanded the work that Ted Turner had started. So I think we're all in that situation. We can't write checks for everything that we're prepared to spare beyond our living expenses to more than one cause. Otherwise, we'll find that we've bounced our checks. So unfortunately, I think we do have choices, and even though I guess it's true that I think both arts and treatment of human illnesses are worthy of support, I think there are differences between them that make the treatment of human illnesses, where it can be done cheaply, more worthy of support. And although I'd like to see the arts flourish, I think in terms of giving, we ought to deal with the with the situation of the global poor, for example, and maybe animal suffering and some other more urgent issues before we give to the arts. Which is not to say, of course, that people won't express themselves artistically. They always have, and I think always will, whether they're receiving philanthropic donations for it or not, but it will be a somewhat different kind of art scene. Okay, now I want to say a little bit about effectiveness, and then I'm going to stop because I do want to make sure you have time for questions. So if you're interested in assessing the effectiveness of particular organizations rather than causes, this is a website to go to, givewell.org. It's also only been around a few years and assesses charities and is very, very rigorous in who passes its screen. And that's why you see on this pie chart only a thin slice of charities that it actually recommends. Now that doesn't mean that all of the other charities are not doing good work. What it does mean is that the other charities have not been able to provide GiveWell with sufficient proof of the effectiveness of what they're doing to make it through their rankings. So it's a case of the difficulty of providing evidence. And in fact, it tends to be rather specialized organizations that get GiveWell's ratings, ones that do nothing but distribute bed nets against malaria, or do nothing but eliminate intestinal parasites from children, or do nothing but hand out cash grants to some of the poorest families in rural villages in developing countries. Because those ones are easy to assess because you can do randomized trials. You can go into, get baseline data from, let's say, 100 villages, do what you do in 50 of them, go back and compare the data in those villages with the ones in the baseline villages where you didn't provide your treatment, and you get very clear evidence of the effect of what you're having, and of course you can know what the cost of what you're having is. So it's these rather specialized organizations with a high level of transparency about what they're doing that GiveWell recommends. And although that's really good, and I do think you ought to look at it if you're interested in effective giving, it's not the only thing. This is another website, Giving What We Can, which has somewhat wider criteria. And this is one that I set up that has now sort of become an independent organization called The Life You Can Save, after the title of the book I published in 2009. And we are also broader. For example, so I said there's a number of people from Oxfam here tonight. So we recommend Oxfam on this list. Oxfam doesn't get on the GiveWell list because it's a large organization that does a range of different things, including advocacy work for the global poor, and GiveWell finds it too hard to assess all of that and to compare the value of different programs. In the book, The Most Good You Can Do, I provide examples of some highly cost-effective advocacy work that Oxfam has done for the global poor, which I think justifies including Oxfam among the organizations that you would want to give to. But of course, Oxfam also does a lot of advocacy that doesn't pay off. Oxfam, I know, advocated for substantial changes to the Farm Bill, which subsidizes wealthy US farmers in a manner that enables them to sell their agricultural products on the global market at prices that are lower than the prices that would sustain small peasant agricultural landholders in developing countries. So it's very harmful to them that they then can't get decent prices for their produce. And it's actually pretty crazy that we're subsidizing these agricultural producers anyway, given that we produce enough food, that we have problems with obesity, and that all the rest of it. But that has been unsuccessful so far. So not every advocacy is a win, but if you get some big wins, and I give certainly one example in the book of a big win at low expense, then I think you can say this is still likely to be a highly effective organization. Okay, I think at that point I should stop because otherwise we won't have much time for questions. So let me close the talk at that point. There are many more things that I could have gone into, but let's see what you in the audience would like to raise that I haven't covered. Do we have, I don't know whether we have roving microphones here or something like that, or are you just going to stand up and shout? What?
Usually just yell it out.
Okay, so stand up and try and project in a loud voice so that everybody can hear it. Yes, over there on the aisle.
So we live in a world with global social media, which allows people in, say, the United States to find out about some tragic situation, often involving maybe an individual or a small community somewhere, which then has the effect that there's a lot of charitable donations to that one particular person or instance or family or whatever it is. And a similar one is when we learn after a natural disaster, the amount of money that people donate is usually associated with how many people die, not how many people survive in maybe natural situations. Can you comment on that, and how we might do that better?
Absolutely. That's a very good point. So we have, I think, certain things in our psychology that prompt giving, and one of them is that there's an identifiable individual we can help. And this has been very well shown in psychological research. There's a guy called Paul Slovic in Oregon who has run an experiment where, for example, where he gets psychology students in, says, you're going to be paid $15 for doing an experiment. He doesn't tell them what the experiment's about. They come in, they get a clipboard with some questions to answer, which actually have nothing to do with the experiment, but they think it does. They hand back the clipboard, they get paid $15 in small notes, and then the person paying them says, by the way, our lab supports a different charity each month. I wonder whether you'd like to contribute some of your earnings to this month's charity. Here's some information about it. And then 50% of the people get given a little picture, a page with a picture of an African girl. They said, this is Rokia, she's 7 years old, she often has to go to bed hungry, etc., etc. And the other 50% just get told, in Malawi or wherever Rokia came from, there are many children who have to go to bed hungry. No picture, no name. So substantially more of the students who get the picture of the girl and the name give. Now, it doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, do they really think that they're all giving, all the money that was raised this month will go to this one girl? Presumably not. But still, the fact that they've seen an image prompts them to give. And I think that's what's going on with the websites, the social media that are referring to. They identify with a particular person. And often that, therefore, distorts the effectiveness of giving if it really were to all go to that person. And similarly, if there's a disaster, people will give. Although, as you say, it may be that there's not many people to help. I mean, the classic case, it's not only the number of people killed, but it's also the location. So the classic case is 9/11. Right? The Red Cross received many millions of dollars to help the victims of 9/11, but essentially most of the victims of 9/11 were dead. So, it could help some of the families, but it ended up so much money that actually the president of Red Cross at first said, well, they were going to hold some of this in reserve for other tragedies. And then she got howled down and had to backtrack. I think even eventually maybe resigned, if I remember it rightly. And Red Cross said, okay, so it's all going to go to people affected by 9/11. So what did they do? They drew a line across Lower Manhattan, and they then set up tables in the lobbies of all the buildings saying, were you adversely affected by 9/11? So here they are in Tribeca, where some of the wealthiest people live, saying, were you adversely affected? And if people said, oh yes, it was the dust and smoke was so bad, I had to move up to a hotel uptown for a week. So then they'll say, well, we'll reimburse you the costs of living in a hotel for a week. All right? I mean, that doesn't make sense, but that is the way people will give. And we should be more aware of that, and we should try and counter that impulse in ourselves. Okay, let's take another question. Right down the front here.
I personally think one of our most serious problems today is climate change. And I wonder, I think trying to approach that is not a simple process. And I think your process here of giving to people that are poor and suffering is a good one, but people that are poor and suffering are going to be most impacted as climate change continues to wreak havoc on our globe. So what would you promote in terms, what do effective altruists promote in terms of climate change?
Would you mind just repeating the question?
Yeah, sure. The question was about climate change, and questioner indicated absolutely accurately, that it's the poor who are going to be most affected, most adversely affected by climate change. And although one can certainly help individuals, what do effective altruists do about something like climate change? So certainly effective altruists think about this. And they're always thinking, well, what is the most effective thing to do? So some of them will support organizations that are fighting climate change, but you need to have some idea of what the strategy is going to be that will produce change. So I think in this case, unlike trying to help people in extreme poverty, you really have to work on your government. Because I think unless the US government does things relating to reducing greenhouse gas emissions in this country, and unless it goes to meetings like the meeting that's going to occur in Paris later this year, with a positive attitude towards trying to reach a serious agreement with countries like China that will result in a significant reduction of greenhouse gases, then we're not going to be able to deal with that problem. So that's one thing that people would do, to try and find effective paths where you could have an impact. Let me just mention one other thing that perhaps is relevant. If you can get a strategy that wins in more than one important area, that's a good thing to do. So there has been discussion in effective altruist circles about the value of promoting a vegetarian or vegan diet, because we know that the livestock industry produces a very large slice of greenhouse gases. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations says it's larger than the entire transport sector, the greenhouse gases produced by the livestock sector. So in addition, if you advocate people boycotting animal products, then you're going to reduce animal suffering, because most of the animal products people eat come from factory farms, which are sources of an immense amount of animal suffering. And since these animals are fed on grain, you also help to contribute to lower world grain prices, which may in certain situations help the poor to buy food, although in general it's better to encourage them to produce food in their own country rather than to give them large quantities of grain produced in the US. But it may have that effect as well. So that's another thing that effective altruists would do, which they think would be a win-win for climate change, for animals, and perhaps for the global poor too. Okay, let's take another question. Gentleman right at the back there. Yeah.
You have a strong preference between regular giving, let's say if you're a young person giving 5%, 10% of their income, versus end of life giving, like after you're towards the end of your life, you've raised money, you've compounded the benefit of that money, giving it then in one large sum?
I don't have a universal position, because I think it depends a little bit on your abilities to use your money. If you're a young Warren Buffett, I strongly recommend that you keep your money and reinvest it, because then you'll have much more to give at the end. So I'm glad that Warren Buffett didn't give away most of the first million that he earned. But of course, it's difficult to predict in advance that you're going to be as successful as Warren Buffett. If you are, I've got some money to invest with you, by the way. So it really does, I think, depend to a significant extent on that. And for most of us, I think there is a rate of return by helping the global poor now. We help to get them on their feet. They can do more things. We help, say, one Oxfam program is to help women become entrepreneurs in Central America. You can, then there'll be spin-offs from that. You can educate girls, and that reduces infant mortality as well as reducing the population, the rate of population growth, because it lowers fertility. So I think it depends. I personally think it's good to get into the habit of giving something regularly, even if you are saving to invest and give more later. I think, again, you have to have those little psychological aids to doing the right thing. And giving regularly is one of them that makes it easier for you to think more about giving later in life. It's a good habit to get into. We got one over there. All right, right up the back over there too. Yeah.
The more I learn about factory farming, the harder the time I have sleeping at night. And since you've written so much about it and know so much about it, are you not a small scale, on a large scale, changing things in addition to the climate change work?
Well, yes, once you know about the way animals are kept in factory farms, it is astonishing that it's still permitted, because if you were to keep a dog in the way that a pig is kept on a factory farm, you would be prosecuted. And yet the farmers do that, immune from prosecution. Many of the state laws about animal welfare actually have specific exemptions for farm animals. So in one sense it's astonishing, in another sense when we understand the power of money and corporate influence, it becomes less astonishing. But Europe has made more progress in at least banning some of the worst forms of factory farming. Not that there isn't a lot of factory farming there, there is, but some of the, the standard small wire cage that most hens are kept in is banned in Europe. The individual stalls for sows and veal calves are banned in Europe, not banned here. Though California has now, as a result of a 2008 referendum that came into effect in January of this year, California has now got rid of some of the worst forms of factory farming, and I hope that will set an example to other states. So it is a big issue, and I have a chapter in the book about the cost effectiveness of working to reduce animal suffering, and I think there are things that can be done in that area which more people should do, but those things are mostly at an individual level. In terms of lobbying government, well, the California referendum was very successful. Maybe we need to try more in other states that have citizen-initiated referenda, and then we need to encourage people to vote with their dollars in states where that isn't possible.
We have time for one or two more.
One or two more? Okay. So there's a gentleman in a white shirt in the middle here.
Yeah, so I recently ate some food at Chipotle, and on the back of the bag that I was given was a pretty cool story about a survey about moral reasoning. The survey asked people to imagine a scenario where there was some sort of disaster and they were in charge of handing out medical supplies to people. And the deal was there weren't enough medical supplies to go around, so how were they to prioritize giving out the supplies to people? Was it going to be by age, by need? And what I found most interesting about it is people refused to prioritize. They hated the idea of prioritizing. They always wanted to say, no, we can figure out another way, we can create more supplies, we can find more, we can use one supply on 2 people. They did whatever they could to avoid prioritization. So given that I think this is a common perspective on prioritization of giving and charity, what are the political implications to spreading effective altruism and talking about conjoined twins versus diseased children?
Absolutely. We are prioritizing, and particularly in the healthcare area, people are very resistant to it, and that's why. And I think particularly in the United States, I have to say, because, for example, in the United Kingdom, politicians can publicly talk about the need to ration healthcare, which effectively is prioritizing, and there is a national institute which costs various treatments and recommends to the regional health authorities which treatments are not sufficiently cost effective to fund and which are. You can't really do that, it seems, in the United States. Politicians can't really talk openly about rationing or prioritizing some treatments over others. So I'm not sure exactly how you change that. I mean, I'm trying to change it, I guess, by talking about it. I have talked in other things about healthcare rationing and the fact that de facto we do ration even if we don't talk about it. But I think the point you're making can be generalized, and that is that it's probably true that we're never going to get to a situation where all of those individual donors who I mentioned give $240 billion a year are going to become effective altruists. I don't know whether effective altruists, I mean, it's growing quite rapidly now. I see the movement, but from a very small base. So high levels of growth are easy from a small base. I don't know where it's going to start plateauing, whether it will reach 5% of donors or 10% of donors. I mean, I think it would do an immense amount of good even if it only gets to that level. And I hope that there are enough people in the community who can see the importance of prioritizing in your philanthropy to make up at least that 10% of it. All right, let's take one last question and we'll take you, yes, in the back there. Yeah.
First of all, thanks for writing the book. It raised effective altruism to me is something that I had maybe heard about, and something I'm thinking a lot more about now. As an environmentalist, as I was reading through the book, I came across the section in which you talked about essentially a pathocentric point of view and the difficulty in comparing or valuing nature kind of for its own sake. I was curious if we do place a value on human and animal welfare, do we not have to find some way to value the Earth, I guess, in its own sake, or in the way that its ecosystem enables life? So I guess I'm a little bit curious to hear your thoughts maybe on expanding beyond pathocentrism. Is that something we should be concerned about philosophically?
Basically focused on beings who can feel, who have feelings, who are sentient, who feel pain or pleasure, so conscious beings. And there, I think, as I've been saying, I talked about suffering, mattering. Difficult to compare, very difficult to actually make the comparisons, but at least in theory, possible to do so. But then you get into these other questions, and I've taught environmental ethics. I co-taught a course at Princeton last year with a conservation biologist, and we tried to get at this. So, how important is it to preserve the last 200 animals of an endangered species as compared with just 200 animals of a very similar species that presumably feels the same but is not at all endangered? And he was arguing strongly that it is more important, that the extinction is something that is an additional wrong. And of course, I think probably most people feel that. I feel that to some extent. But I really don't know how you would weigh that. How much extra suffering would you be prepared to cause in order to protect the endangered species? And it is sometimes like that. You sometimes, for example, I'm from Australia, where we have a lot of feral animals that were introduced by Europeans, and they compete with wildlife. And the only way to save the indigenous species is to kill them, and often that can't be done in any humane way. It can only be done by poisoning, or, for example, rabbits have been controlled by spreading myxomatosis, which is a horrible disease that kills rabbits slowly over days. So is that worth doing or not? If somebody can provide arguments for this that gives you a metric, I think it would be a really interesting philosophical contribution. At the moment, I can only say I don't really know how to do that. I would like to be able to give some weight to things like preserving endangered species, but I can't really see how to do it except in terms that make it instrumental to the well-being of others now and in future, which one can do to some extent, but that's of course not really what the conservationists and ecologists want to do. They want to give it intrinsic weight. So on that sort of humble note of not really having an answer to your question, I think we'll have to leave it. I'll be very happy to sign books for you and talk to you down at this table here afterwards. Thank you.
Each of these, as I said, they're very short. They're basically a couple paragraphs of text that juxtapose on one side images from the history of libraries of that particular device, and then patent proposals of futuristic, sometimes sort of slightly visionary reinterpretations of those devices.